You sink into the silk hammock, suspended high above the jungle floor. The scent of orchids and damp earth fills the humid night air. But then, the lights flicker, and in the sudden darkness you hear it, a faint scratching inside the bamboo walls, not the random scrabbling of a gecko, but a steady, deliberate drag of something sharp, pausing exactly when you hold your breath. This is the dark reality of the remote eco-resort where sustainable luxury becomes a deadly illusion. I'm your host, and tonight on True Terror Files Official, we are vanishing deep into the rainforest canopy, where four guests checked into paradise and checked out into a primal nightmare, like the solo traveler who realized her treehouse suite had no functioning lock, just as heavy footsteps began testing the rope bridge. Or the honeymoon couple who woke to find their glass floor covered in muddy palm prints, left by something that had slithered beneath them while they slept. Then there was the man trapped on a rotting balcony, listening to an unidentifiable whisper mimicking his wife's voice from the impenetrable tree line. And finally, a volunteer ranger who discovered that the deep jungle trail behind his bungalow wasn't empty at all. Something had been stalking him for miles, leaving strange bite marks on the waterproof camera gear he left outside. These are four true stories where eco-resorts became claustrophobic death traps. Miles from any help, swallowed by the wet, predatory darkness. So secure your mosquito net, and whatever you do, don't look down through the floorboards. Liam's first mistake was thinking isolation meant peace, the kind of silence you can't buy with a spa package. The promotional photos had promised a handcrafted bamboo treehouse suspended 20 feet above the jungle floor, a place where the only sound was the distant rush of a hidden waterfall and the whisper of banana leaves in the trade winds. He'd booked the rainforest canopy suite at an eco-resort nestled deep in the volcanic interior of Hawaii's Big Island, a boutique property so remote that the final leg of the journey required a stripped-down ATV and a guide who spoke maybe 10 words total. Liam had smiled through the bumpy ride, inhaling the wet, fecund air, watching the asphalt dissolve into a muddy track swallowed by prehistoric ferns. He needed this escape after the collapse of his startup and a breakup that left him sleeping on a friend's sofa in Portland. A whole Pacific Ocean and a wall of green now stood between him and the wreckage of his former life. The resort consisted of 5 luxury treehouses connected by a network of swaying rope bridges and elevated wooden walkways, each suite carefully positioned to guarantee absolute privacy. Solar-powered lanterns flickered along the paths, casting shivering pools of amber light that never quite reached the ground, and everywhere Liam looked, the jungle pressed in, thick and hungry, as if waiting for the electricity to fail. A young host with sun-bleached dreadlocks and a name tag that read Kai checked him in at an open-air pavilion, handing over a key tied to a piece of driftwood and a laminated card detailing emergency procedures. The card warned about wild boars, centipedes the length of a forearm, and sudden flash floods that could wash out the single-access road within minutes, but the part Liam remembered most was the handwritten note scrawled at the bottom. It said, "Please do not leave your treehouse after sunset without a guide. The forest floor is not safe at night." He chuckled to himself, a city boy playing adventurer, thinking it was just theatrical branding designed to sell the illusion of danger without any real risk. By the time he reached Treehouse 4, swinging his canvas duffel bag onto the small deck, the sun had already begun its rapid tropical descent, and the jungle was transforming from a vibrant cathedral of green into something far less welcoming. The treehouse itself was undeniably gorgeous. Vaulted ceilings of woven palm thatch, a bed draped in white mosquito netting, and a private deck with a hammock looking out over a ravine choked with flowering heliconia. A small bamboo ladder led to a rooftop platform where guests could practice yoga at sunrise, but for now the platform only served to remind Liam how exposed he really was, a single human shape outlined against a sky darkening to bruised purple. He set his bag on the hand-carved trunk that served as a nightstand and did what any modern human would do. He pulled out his phone to check for a signal, hoping to send a quick photo to prove he'd finally made it. No bars, not even a flicker. The resort's literature had boasted about this, a complete digital detox, but standing there in the thick, wet silence, it felt less like a detox and more like an amputation. He explored the tiny space instead, running his fingers over the smooth bamboo walls, admiring the open-air shower that used captured rainwater, and testing the sliding glass door that led to the deck, which glided open with a satisfyingly solid feel. Then he checked the front door, a rustic-looking slab of reclaimed wood fitted with a simple hook and eye latch. No deadbolt, no chain, no modern lock at all, just a flimsy brass hook that barely caught the edge of its eyelet, and even then a firm shove from outside would probably rip the whole thing clean off the jamb. Liam felt a small prickle of unease at the base of his skull, but the rational part of his brain told him he was being ridiculous. Who else was out here? 2 other guests, the host and a handful of staff who probably lived in a bunkhouse a mile away. He was alone. Perfectly, blissfully alone, night swallowed the jungle with a speed that still surprised him, even after reading about the tropical twilight. One moment the sky was a fading watercolor of pink and lavender, and the next it was a bowl of ink pierced only by the pulsing green dots of fireflies. The chorus of coqui frogs erupted from every direction, so deafeningly loud that at first he thought it was some kind of mechanical alarm. A wall of sound so dense it seemed to vibrate inside his chest. Liam sat on the deck for a while, sipping a lukewarm beer from the minibar and listening, identifying the different layers of sound like a naturalist, the chirps, the whistles, the distant hoot of something large and unseen. Then he heard a new sound, one that didn't belong in any field guide. It was a creak, a long, slow, metallic groan, coming from the rope bridge that connected his treehouse to the main walkway about 40 yards to his left. He leaned forward in his hammock, squinting into the dark, but the solar lanterns on the path had dimmed to a weak ember, and the bridge itself was just a black slash against the deeper black of the ravine. Probably just the wind. He told himself, though the air had gone completely still, the frogs strangely quieting for a few beats before resuming their manic pulse. He decided to go inside, suddenly aware of how vulnerable he felt sitting out in the open, a pale target against the dark wood, the hammock swaying with his every breath. The front door didn't sit flush with its frame, leaving a gap at the bottom wide enough to slide a hand through. And as Liam knelt to inspect it, a cool draft washed over his fingers, carrying a smell that was all wet earth and decaying vegetation. He hooked the eye latch, or tried to. The hook kept slipping because the screw holding the eye plate had loosened over time, pulling free from the soft bamboo enough that the hook could no longer reach. Liam wiggled it, attempting to force it into place, but the entire fixture shifted in his grip, and he realized with a hollow, sinking dread that the door could not be locked at all. A grown man could lean on it, and the hook would pop free like a cheap toy, maybe even without trying. He stood there for a long moment, hand still on the useless latch, listening. The frogs screamed, the jungle breathed, and somewhere out beyond the veil of leaves, something else breathed too. He told himself it didn't matter because there was no one around to test the door anyway. He was miles from the nearest town, in a gated resort that barely existed on a map. The only danger was the imaginary kind that paranoid minds conjured in the dark. But his body didn't believe him. His heart had become a trapped bird beating against his ribs, and his palms left damp prints on the bamboo wall. To calm himself, he went through the motions of getting ready for bed, brushing his teeth with bottled water, pulling the mosquito netting tight around the mattress, and sliding under the crisp linen sheets that smelled faintly of eucalyptus. He left the bedside lantern on its lowest setting, a tiny island of golden light in an ocean of black. The glass door to the deck remained uncovered, a floor-to-ceiling panel of darkness that reflected his own nervous face back at him. Sleep came in uneven waves, thin and easily shattered. Each time he drifted off, some new sound would yank him back to consciousness. a branch snapping far below, the rustle of leaves directly beneath the floorboards, and once something that sounded like a low, guttural grunt, the kind a large animal might make when scenting something unfamiliar. Liam checked his phone again out of pure habit. Still no signal, but the clock read 1:47 a.m. and the battery had drained to 12% without a single app running. He was considering whether to just stay awake until dawn when the footsteps started. Not the soft, scurrying patter of a mongoose on the forest floor, but something far more deliberate, heavy bipedal footsteps, each one producing a distinct thump followed by a slight vibration that traveled up through the tree trunk and into the floorboards beneath his bare feet. They were walking along the rope bridge. He was sure of it now, because the bridge cables emitted a low resonant hum each time weight shifted, a sound like a plucked cello string slowly dying. Liam froze in the center of the room, one hand still clutching the useless key to a lock that didn't exist. His eyes fixed on the front door with the terrible certainty that it was about to swing open. The footsteps stopped right outside, maybe 10 feet from where he stood on the small landing where the rope bridge met the wraparound deck. A long, unbearable silence followed, the kind of silence that felt heavy, pressurized, as if the air itself was waiting for something awful to happen. Then came the scratching, not on the walls this time, but on the door itself, a slow, exploratory scrape like a fingernail tracing the grain of the wood, pausing at the gap beneath the door where the draft snaked through and then resuming again, more insistent. Liam's legs wouldn't move, his entire body had locked into a state of primal paralysis, every nerve screaming at him to hide, but his muscles refusing to obey. He could hear breathing now. A wet, heavy respiration that didn't sound quite human, yet was far too controlled to be anything else, each exhale fluttering the loose edge of the thatch roofing. The door handle rattled. Once, twice, a third time, the cheap hook jangling against the eyelet like a bell. Liam finally forced himself to move, stumbling backward toward the glass slider. His only other exit was the deck on the opposite side of the treehouse, but that led to a steep drop into the ravine with no ladder and no path. He slid the glass door open, stepping out onto the small back deck, and the night swallowed him instantly. No lanterns back here. Only the dim glow of stars blotted out by the canopy. The scratching stopped the moment his bare foot touched the outdoor wood. And in the new silence, he heard a man's voice, low and rasping, speaking from the other side of the bamboo wall, saying words he couldn't quite decipher, the tone calm and conversational, as if the intruder were simply leaving a voicemail. Then the footsteps resumed, but this time they were retreating, the bridge cables humming lower and lower, until the sound faded completely into the frog chorus. Liam stayed on the back deck for what felt like hours, shivering in the damp heat, arms wrapped around his knees, listening to the jungle return to its normal rhythm while his mind replayed the sound of that voice on a loop. At some point, a pale gray light began to bleed through the canopy, and the coqui frogs finally fell silent. Dawn in the jungle came not with a burst of color, but with a gradual thinning of shadows, like a curtain being slowly lifted. He ventured back inside, every joint aching, and saw the front door still closed, the useless hook still hanging limply from its eyelet. Nothing had been disturbed, nothing taken. No muddy footprints on the polished bamboo, but there was something on the floor by the threshold, a single green palm frond freshly torn, its stem glistening with sap where it had been twisted from the stalk. It had been placed there deliberately, laid parallel to the door gap, like an offering or a marker. Liam packed his bag in under 3 minutes, hands trembling so badly he could barely work the zipper. He didn't care about checkout procedures or the environmental damage of running an ATV engine before 7 a.m. The rope bridge swayed under his weight as he fled toward the main pavilion, and he couldn't help but look down. The ravine below was a tangle of mossy boulders and thick ferns, but wedged between 2 rocks, he saw something that made his stomach lurch. A nest, a human-sized nest, woven from broken branches, dried palm fronds, and what looked like strips of torn fabric, some of them still brightly colored like the resort's signature linens. Someone had been living down there, sleeping directly beneath the treehouse, watching the guests move around in their little cage of glass and bamboo, waiting for the lights to go out. Kai, the host with the sun-bleached dreadlocks, was already awake when Liam burst into the pavilion, and the expression on the young man's face was not surprise, but a weary, resigned recognition. Liam demanded answers, his voice cracking with exhaustion and barely suppressed terror, and Kai just nodded slowly, picking up a two-way radio that looked like it hadn't been used in years. "You saw him then?" Kai said quietly. "Not as a question. The one we're not supposed to talk about to the guests." He explained in short, reluctant bursts that the resort had been built on land that once belonged to a solitary man who'd rejected all contact with the outside world, a recluse who'd vanished into the jungle decades before the first bamboo beam was ever installed. The developers thought he was long dead, but the staff knew better. They'd found his shelters, his half-eaten fruit caches, the odd collection of guest room items that had gone missing over the years. He never hurt anyone. Kai insisted, not once, but he liked to visit the tree houses at night, pressing his ear to the walls, leaving little gifts of twisted palm fronds for the sleeping occupants to find in the morning. The resort management buried every report, fired any staff member who spoke up, and installed the no walking after sunset rule to avoid another incident. But they never fixed the locks, because fixing the locks meant admitting there was a reason to need them. Liam listened to all of this in a numb, hollow silence. The morning sun now blazing over the canopy, turning the rope bridges into golden threads, making the whole nightmare feel like a fever dream. He didn't wait for the scheduled ATV. He walked the 3 miles down the muddy track on foot, his duffel bag banging against his hip, until he reached a narrow paved road where a farmer in a pickup truck eventually stopped. The farmer didn't ask any questions, just nodded at the wild look in Liam's eyes and drove him all the way to Hilo. Radio playing soft ukulele music the entire time, a surreal counterpoint to the horror still crawling under his skin. Liam never wrote a negative review. He never told anyone the full story until now, because who would believe that a luxury eco-resort hid a feral man in its basement of leaves? But he never forgot the sound of that breathing on the other side of the bamboo, or the voice murmuring words he was grateful not to understand. And to this day, whenever he stays in a hotel, any hotel, he checks the lock first. Then he checks the gap under the door, pressing a towel into the space until no light, no air, and no dark gift can slip through. The eco-lodge was called Moss and Mist, a name that sounded like a scented candle but was, in reality, a cluster of architect-designed glass cubes hidden in the ancient temperate rainforest of British Columbia's Great Bear region. The kind of place where the trees were 1,000 years old and the moss hung in curtains thicker than a man's arm. Noah had booked it as a surprise for his wife Jenna, a belated honeymoon after a year of saving and planning, 2 weeks of pure, mist-choked solitude in a luxury suite suspended 15 feet above a forest floor that had never known a chainsaw. The promotional video showed floor-to-ceiling windows, a hot tub carved from local riverstone, and the resort's signature feature, a tempered glass panel in the center of the living area that allowed guests to observe the undergrowth directly beneath their feet. The video's narrator had called it a window into the wilderness, promising sightings of spotted owls, shy pine martens, and the occasional black bear ambling through the ferns, a living nature documentary playing out beneath the furniture. Noah and Jenna arrived by float plane skimming over an archipelago of pine-crowned islands before touching down on a mirror-still lake that reflected the snow-capped peaks of the coast mountains. A pilot named Garrick, bearded and laconic, helped them unload their luggage onto a dock built of rough cedar logs. From there, a silent electric cart took them up a winding path through a cathedral of Sitka spruce and western red cedar, the air so thick with the scent of resin and wet earth that it coated the back of Noah's throat like a syrup. Their lodge host, a wiry woman with steel-gray hair, and a name tag that reads Sylvie greeted them with mugs of wild nettle tea and a laminated wildlife briefing card. The card listed black bears, coastal wolves, and the elusive Commodie spirit bear, a cream-colored subspecies revered by the local First Nations. It also mentioned something else at the bottom, almost as an afterthought. Cougars are rare but present. If you encounter one, make yourself large and do not run. Report all sightings immediately. Noah had grinned at Jenna, squeezing her hand, whispering something about how he could take a cougar in a fight. She'd rolled her eyes, but the shared joke had felt like a warm blanket against the creeping sense of smallness that the forest imposed. Their suite, Cedar 3, was more beautiful than any hotel room they'd ever seen, reclaimed timber walls. A bed piled with wool blankets, and that glass floor panel, roughly 4 feet square, positioned between the sofa and the stone fireplace. Jenna had immediately dropped to her hands and knees, pressing her face against the glass to watch a family of small brown mushrooms that glowed faintly bioluminescent in the dim light. She'd called Noah over, and for a few perfect minutes, they'd both lain on the floor like children, marveling at the tiny world below. The glass itself was framed by thick steel and embedded with small LED lights around its perimeter that could be switched on to illuminate the space beneath the treehouse. A feature designed for nighttime wildlife watching, though Sylvie had warned them that leaving the lights on too long attracted moths the size of dinner plates. The first night passed without incident. They ate smoked salmon and artisanal cheese, made love in a bed that smelled of cedar, and fell asleep to the sound of rain drumming softly on the roof, a percussion that felt protective rather than threatening. The second night was when the dream started. Noah woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of Jenna murmuring in her sleep, her voice a low, urgent whisper that he couldn't quite decode. He assumed she was just having a vivid dream, the side effect of a day spent hiking through moss-draped canyons and learning to identify wolf tracks in the mud. He'd kissed her forehead and rolled over, pulling the wool blanket up to his chin, but just as he started to drift back into sleep, he heard something else, a faint rhythmic sound coming from directly beneath the bed. It was a scraping. No, it was a sliding, a wet, heavy drag, like something muscular was pulling itself across the damp earth under the floorboards. Noah's eyes opened in the darkness, and he lay perfectly still, listening. The sound continued for another 5 or 6 seconds before stopping, replaced by a silence so complete that even the rain seemed to have paused in deference to it. He told himself it was a porcupine, a raccoon, anything small and harmless that the glass panel would let him identify in the morning, and eventually, exhaustion won over fear, pulling him back down into a dreamless sleep. Dawn came slowly in the rainforest, a gradual brightening of the mist rather than a sunrise. Noah made coffee using the French press, stepped out onto the deck to breathe in the cold, pine-saturated air, and noticed something strange about the ground beneath the treehouse. The undergrowth looked disturbed. Ferns that had been upright the previous day were now flattened, their fronds bent in a single direction as if something large had rolled over them, and there was a dark, greasy smear along the base of the nearest cedar trunk, about 3 feet off the ground. Noah called Jenna out to look, and they both leaned over the deck railing, peering down. The smear was too dark to identify, but it glistened with moisture, reflecting the pale gray light like oil. They decided not to worry about it. The forest was full of large animals, and the resort had been operating for 12 years without a single guest injury, a statistic Sylvie had proudly quoted at check-in. The third night, the honeymoon fantasy began to curdle. They'd returned from a guided kayak excursion through a maze of islets where harbor seals had watched them with liquid black eyes. Jenna was sun-flushed and happy, her hair smelling of salt and cedar, and they'd opened a bottle of wine to celebrate. The sun set early behind the mountains, and by 8 p.m. the forest was a wall of absolute black. They switched on the floor panel lights, a soft amber glow that illuminated the understory like a diorama, and settled onto the sofa to watch for nocturnal visitors. For a while, nothing happened, just a few moths bumping against the glass and a curious mouse that scurried across a rotting log before vanishing into a hole. Then, around 10:30 p.m., Jenna grabbed Noah's arm hard enough to bruise. She was pointing at the far edge of the illuminated circle where the amber light bled into darkness. Something had moved, something pale and low to the ground, sliding through the ferns with a fluid, almost serpentine motion. Noah leaned forward, wineglass forgotten. The movement resolved into a shape, but it wasn't an animal he could name. Not a bear, not a wolf, not any of the creatures on Sylvie's laminated card. It was long and sinuous, pale gray like the underbelly of a fish, and it seemed to have too many limbs, or maybe limbs that were too long, reaching forward to drag its body across the wet earth in a motion that was not quite crawling and not quite slithering. Jenna whispered that it looked like a person. A person moving on its stomach, elbows digging into the mud, legs trailing uselessly behind. Noah wanted to dismiss it, to find a rational explanation, but the more he watched, the harder it became to unsee the humanoid quality of the thing, the way one limb extended carefully to grip a root before the body pulled forward, then the head, if it was a head, lifted slightly, turning in their direction, and two faint points of reflected light glinted back from just above the ground. It knew they were watching. The lights beneath the treehouse flickered once, a brief dimming that felt choreographed, and when the glow steadied again, the shape was gone. The ferns swayed gently where it had passed, but the circle of amber light showed only empty soil and the same family of glowing mushrooms they'd spotted on the first day. Noah and Jenna sat in silence for a long time, the wine bottle sweating condensation onto the side table. Neither of them wanted to say what they'd seen, because saying it would make it real. And the honeymoon was supposed to be a happy memory, not a horror story. They went to bed without discussing it, a silent pact of denial. But Noah didn't sleep, and he could tell by the rhythm of her breathing that Jenna didn't either. Somewhere around 3 a.m., the scraping sound returned. Closer this time, directly beneath the glass panel, so loud that the steel frame transmitted a faint vibration through the floor. Noah turned on the bedside lamp, the sudden light revealing Jenna already sitting up, eyes wide, one hand pressed over her own mouth to stifle a scream. She was staring at the floor panel, which was visible through the open bedroom doorway. From the bed, they could see the amber-lit square of glass, and the glass was no longer empty. Pressed against the underside of the panel, flattened like a specimen against a microscope slide, was a hand. A human hand, broad and thick-fingered, coated in wet black mud. The fingers were splayed wide, the palm print smeared slightly as the hand slowly slid downward, leaving a greasy trail on the glass. Then another hand joined it, and another set of prints appeared, overlapping the first. Noah's brain short-circuited, trying to process the impossible geometry. Something was down there, lying on its back in the mud directly beneath their floor, pressing its hands against the glass while staring up through it. He bolted out of bed, grabbing the heavy steel fireplace poker from beside the hearth, and crept toward the floor panel with his heart slamming against his sternum. Each step revealed more of the smeared handprints, dozens of them now, crisscrossing the glass in a chaotic lattice of mud, but the hands were gone. The thing that had left them had already slid away into the darkness beyond the LED lights, leaving only its muddy signature behind. Jenna was crying, a low, hitching sound, and Noah felt a cold, sick anger rising in his chest. Not at the creature, whatever it was, but at the resort for stranding them in a glass box over a monster's highway. He switched off the floor lights, plunging the underside into blackness, and tried the door. The front door had a modern keycard lock, which engaged with a reassuring clunk, but the sliding glass door to the deck was another story. It locked with a simple latch that any determined force could probably pop open, and the deck itself had no barrier to the ground, just a set of open stairs leading down into the same ferns where the thing had been crawling. Noah dragged the sofa in front of the glass slider, piling the heavy coffee table on top of it for good measure. A pathetic barricade, but the act of building it gave him something to do other than panic. They spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the bedroom with the fireplace poker across Noah's knees, listening to the forest. The rain had stopped, and in the silence they could hear breathing, a wet, labored sound that seemed to circle the treehouse in slow, patient loops. Dawn brought no relief. When the gray light finally seeped through the windows, Noah and Jenna packed their bags with the frantic efficiency of people fleeing a natural disaster, shoving clothes into suitcases without folding, not bothering to collect the toiletries or the souvenirs. The mud prints on the glass floor panel were still visible, now drying to a crusty brown. They were unmistakably human, each one showing 5 distinct fingers with the halls and ridges of friction skin as clear as any police booking photo. Noah took a picture with his phone, then another, documenting the impossible evidence. He wanted to march down to the main lodge and shove the photos in Sylvie's face, demand answers, demand a helicopter extraction. But when they unbarricaded the sliding door and stepped onto the deck, they discovered something that turned their fear into a cold, creeping dread that far outweighed any anger. The stairs leading down to the forest floor were gone, not broken, not damaged, but systematically dismantled, each wooden plank removed and stacked in a neat pile about 20 feet away, as if someone had decided the guests of Cedar 3 didn't need a way down anymore. The only exit now was the front door, which led to a narrow elevated walkway that connected to the main path, a path that was half a mile long, winding through dense undergrowth with no lighting except whatever the canopy allowed through. Noah didn't wait for a guide. He grabbed Jenna's hand and they half ran along the walkway, the boards creaking under their combined weight, the forest pressing in on both sides. The walk to the main lodge felt endless. Every shadow a potential threat, every rustle in the undergrowth a promise of something pale and long-limbed sliding toward them. But they reached the pavilion without seeing anything more frightening than a startled grouse. Sylvie was there, pouring tea for a new set of guests who had just arrived, a German couple in matching rain jackets. She looked up at Noah's wild expression with the same weary resignation he remembered from a different story, a different forest, a different host. He showed her the photos, his voice shaking as he described the hands pressed against the glass, the dismantled stairs, the thing that had looked at them with reflected light. Sylvie didn't flinch, didn't gasp, just set down the teapot and wiped her hands on her apron. She told them in a voice far calmer than any human voice should be in such circumstances that the resort had been aware of something living in the old logging tunnels beneath that section of the property for several years, tunnels left over from the early 1900s, long collapsed and overgrown, but still accessible to something that didn't mind squeezing through tight, dark spaces. The creature, she said, had never hurt anyone. It just seemed fascinated by the glass panels, by the warmth and light, by the sight of humans moving around above it like fish in an aquarium. The First Nations elders in the nearby village called it a bukwas, a wild man of the forest, neither fully human nor fully animal, a mimic that lived in the liminal spaces between civilization and wilderness, curious about visitors, but best left alone. The resort management had installed the LED lights hoping to deter it, believing it disliked direct illumination. But clearly, over the years, it had grown bolder, less afraid of the amber glow, more interested in the creatures that lived inside the glass boxes. Noah listened to all of this with his suitcase still in his hand, his wife still trembling against his shoulder. A part of him wanted to scream, to demand why none of this had been disclosed, why a honeymoon suite had been built directly above a known lair of something that left muddy handprints on the glass. But another part of him, a quieter, more exhausted part, just wanted to leave, to get on the float plane and fly back to a world where floors were solid concrete and monsters existed only on screens. Sylvie radioed Garrick, and within an hour the float plane was skimming across the lake, lifting them away from moss and mist and its 1,000-year-old trees. Noah watched the resort shrink through the window, a cluster of glass cubes nestled in an ocean of green, and thought about how many other suites had glass floor panels just like theirs. He and Jenna flew back to Vancouver in near total silence, holding hands across the aisle, not speaking because there were no words for what they'd survived. Their marriage would survive too, bonded now by a shared trauma that no one else would ever fully believe. But Noah still has the photos on his phone, the ones showing the mud prints on the glass. He looks at them sometimes in the middle of the night, zooming in on the halls and ridges, trying to convince himself that they were just animal tracks, just a raccoon, just his imagination. And then he sees the thumb perfectly opposed, exactly like a human's, pressing into the glass with enough force to leave a visible pressure crack in the center of the smudge. Something under the floor had been watching them sleep. Something that had learned, over years of quiet observation, how to dismantle a staircase without making a sound. He and Jenna have never gone camping again. Never stayed in a cabin, never even rented a ground floor apartment, because the thing about glass floors is that they work both ways, and whatever lives beneath the moss and mist of that ancient rainforest, it's still down there, waiting for the lights to come on, waiting for the next pair of faces to appear above the glass, waiting to press its hands against the barrier and wonder what it would take to finally break through. The Daintree rainforest was a place where the ancient world still breathed, a tangle of primeval ferns, towering bullcari pines, and strangler figs that had been slowly consuming their host trees for centuries before Oliver's grandparents were born. He and his wife, Sophie, had chosen the Canopy Hideaway Eco-Resort for their 10th anniversary, a cluster of luxury tree houses perched on stilts above a cassowary-plumed gully, accessible only by a winding boardwalk that snaked 2 kilometers through the densest section of the World Heritage-listed jungle. The brochure described the location as the oldest continuously surviving rainforest on Earth. A living museum of dinosaur-era flora where every leaf dripped with moisture and every shadow held a secret older than humanity. Oliver had laughed at the poetic language, but Sophie had loved it. She'd always been the romantic one, the one who saw magic in the bioluminescent fungi and heard music in the chorus of tree frogs that erupted each evening. Their treehouse, Gondwana Suite, was an architectural marvel of recycled ironbark and floor-to-ceiling insect screens, but its defining feature was a wraparound balcony that jutted out over the gully, offering an unobstructed view of the rainforest canopy stretching all the way to the Coral Sea. The balcony had been one of the main selling points in the photos. A private sanctuary where guests could eat breakfast while watching the mist rise through the ancient trees, the sun turning the leaves into 1,000 shades of green, but the photos hadn't shown the fine cracks webbing through the timber decking or the way certain planks sagged noticeably under even a child's weight, their fibers softened by decades of tropical humidity and the relentless gnawing of termites. Oliver noticed the decay the moment he stepped out to admire the view. The boards creaked beneath his hiking boots, and one section near the railing felt spongy, yielding slightly as if the wood had turned to wet cardboard. He'd mentioned it to the resort manager, a gaunt man named Elias who wore a faded Acubra hat and smelled faintly of eucalyptus oil. Elias had waved a dismissive hand, assuring him that the balcony had been inspected just last season, that the wood was naturally flexible, that no guest had ever fallen through. Sophie had squeezed Oliver's arm, whispering that he worried too much, that he should just enjoy the view and stop looking for problems. She had a way of making his anxieties feel like a character flaw rather than a survival instinct, and he'd let the matter drop. The first 2 days were idyllic. They hiked to a waterfall where the water was so cold it stole their breath. They ate barramundi grilled over an open fire. They fell asleep to the sound of rain drumming on the corrugated iron roof. But on the 3rd night, the rain stopped, and in the new silence, Oliver began to hear things he couldn't explain. It started with the whispers, faint, sibilant sounds that drifted up from the gully below the balcony, too quiet to make out words but too deliberate to be the random noise of wind through leaves. He first noticed them around 2 a.m. when he'd woken up thirsty and padded barefoot to the kitchenette for a glass of water. The insect screens muffled the outside world, but through them he could still hear a low, continuous murmur coming from somewhere in the darkness. He stood at the screen door, peering out at the balcony, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound seemed to be moving, shifting from one side of the gully to the other, as if something was circling the treehouse while speaking softly to itself. Sophie called out from the bedroom, her voice thick with sleep. She asked if everything was okay, and Oliver said yes, just getting water, just the jungle making jungle noises, nothing to worry about. But he didn't go back to bed for almost an hour. He sat in the darkness of the living area, listening to the whisper continue its slow circuit around the treehouse until exhaustion finally pulled him back under. The next morning, Sophie was gone. He woke to an empty bed and a note on the pillow, written in her looping cursive, "Gone. For a sunrise walk to the lookout. Back by 8. Coffees in the French press. Love you." Oliver smiled, picturing her with her camera slung around her neck, her ginger hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her hiking sandals making soft crunching sounds on the boardwalk. She'd always been an early riser, always chasing the golden hour light for her photography. He made himself breakfast, read a few chapters of a paperback thriller, and didn't start to worry until 9 a.m. came and went with no sign of Sophie. She was never late, not ever. Punctuality was practically her religion. By 9:30, he'd radioed the main lodge to ask if anyone had seen her. Elias answered, his voice crackling through the static, saying he hadn't spotted any guests on the trails that morning, but he'd send a staff member to check the lookout. At 10:15, the radio crackled again. The lookout was empty. No sign of Sophie, no camera, no footprints in the mud, nothing except a single hiking sandal lying in the middle of the viewing platform as if it had been kicked off in a hurry. Oliver felt the floor drop out from under his stomach. He pulled on his boots, grabbed a water bottle and a flashlight, and was halfway out the door when Elias's voice came through the radio again, this time with a sharp edge of urgency. The staff had found something else on the trail leading back from the lookout, a set of tracks. Not Sophie's, pressed deep into the mud, showing bare feet that were longer and narrower than any human foot had a right to be. The tracks paralleled Sophie's own footprints for about 50 meters. Then her prints veered off the trail into the dense undergrowth, as if she'd been chasing something, or following something, or being led. Oliver wanted to join the search party immediately, to crash through the bush shouting her name, but Elias told him to stay put, to remain at the treehouse in case Sophie returned on her own, to be a fixed point in the chaos. Reluctantly, he agreed, and that decision, made with the best of intentions, would trap him in a nightmare that hadn't even begun to unfurl its full horror. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. The radio stayed silent except for occasional crackles of static, and every time Oliver tried to raise Elias, the response was the same: "Nothing yet, stay where you are, we'll update you soon." By sunset, the fear had curdled into something colder and harder. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty pillow where Sophie's head should have been, the note still clutched in his hand, the words "love you" now reading like a goodbye. The frogs began their evening chorus, a wall of sound that filled the gully, but beneath it, Oliver could hear the whisper again, the same low murmur he'd noticed the night before, only now it was closer, much closer. He stepped out onto the balcony to listen. The planks sagged and creaked beneath his weight, one of them cracking audibly as a hairline fracture became a visible split, but he was too fixated on the sound to care about the floor. The whisper was coming from the tree line about 30 meters down the slope, and as the last light faded from the sky, Oliver realized with a jolt of pure electric terror that the whisper was speaking his name. "Oliver, Oliver, come down here, please." It was Sophie's voice, unmistakably Sophie's voice, with the same slight lisp on the is sounds, the same gentle upward inflection at the end of each phrase, the same warmth that had made him fall in love with her 12 years ago. But there was something wrong with it, something he couldn't immediately identify, a subtle wrongness that scraped at the back of his brain like a fingernail on slate. He gripped the railing, leaning forward, his heart slamming against his ribs. The voice was coming from a dense thicket of wait-a-while vines and lawyer cane, a thorny tangle that no human could possibly move through without leaving torn clothing and skin behind. "Oliver, I'm hurt. Please, I need you." The voice cracked on the word hurt, a perfect simulation of pain and fear, but the cadence was slightly off, the pauses between words landing in the wrong places, as if the speaker was reading a script without understanding the meaning behind the syllables. Oliver called out Sophie's name, his own voice hoarse and desperate. The The whispering stopped immediately, the jungle falling silent in a way that felt deliberate, attentive, as if something was listening to him with the same intensity he was using to listen to it. Then the voice came again, closer this time, maybe 20 meters away. "Oliver, why won't you come down? Don't you love me?" That was when Oliver felt the first plank give way. His right foot punched through the rotted timber with a sound like a fist going through wet cardboard. He lurched sideways, grabbing the railing just in time to keep himself from plunging through the gap, his leg dangling into the dark space beneath the balcony. The railing itself groaned, the rusted screws holding it to the treehouse wall, pulling loose with a series of small metallic pings. Oliver scrambled backward onto more solid wood, his hands shaking, his pant leg torn from the knee down. He sat there on the balcony floor, breathing in ragged gasps, staring at the hole his foot had made. The wood around the edges was dark and spongy with rot, riddled with the tiny tunnels of termite galleries, and the drop below was at least 30 feet into a tangled mess of thorn bushes and exposed roots. He was trapped. The only exit from the balcony was back through the sliding screen door into the treehouse, but even that route required him to cross a section of decking that now looked dangerously unstable. The whisper returned, and this time it was no longer Sophie's voice. It was something else, something that had stopped pretending. "Oliver, Oliver, the wood is old, isn't it? The wood is so very old." The voice had dropped an octave, losing all trace of Sophie's warmth. It sounded like a recording being played at the wrong speed. The syllables stretched and distorted, the breathing patterns entirely absent. Oliver pressed his back against the treehouse wall, his eyes scanning the tree line. The last light had faded completely, and the only illumination came from the dim solar lanterns on the boardwalk, casting long, wavering shadows through the leaves. He saw movement, a shape detaching itself from the darkness between two ancient cycad palms low to the ground, pale and hairless, moving with a strange jerky gait as if its joints were hinged in the wrong directions. It stopped at the edge of the cleared area beneath the balcony, tilting its head upward. Oliver could see its face now, or what passed for a face, a smooth, featureless expanse of pale gray skin with two dark hollows where eyes should have been. The mouth was the worst part. It was too wide, stretching from one side of the jaw to the other, and it was moving, forming Sophie's words without any tongue or teeth visible. Just a dark, wet cavity that shaped the sounds as they emerged. "Come down. Come down to me. You'll be with her again. She's down here waiting." Oliver's mind reeled, grasping for any rational explanation. A prank, a hallucination, a night parrot mimicking human speech like a lyrebird, anything that would let him believe the world still operated by the rules he understood. But the thing in the clearing wasn't a bird, and the longer he stared at it, the more he realized that the pale skin wasn't skin at all, but a layer of some kind of fungal growth, white and rubbery, like the mushrooms that grew on dead logs in the deepest shade. It moved closer, placing one elongated hand on the base of a support post. The post shuddered slightly, the rot-weakened timber groaning under the added pressure, and the entire balcony swayed. Oliver screamed, a raw animal sound that tore out of his throat. He scrambled toward the screen door on his hands and knees, testing each plank before putting his full weight on it, the wood creaking and cracking beneath him like thin ice. He made it inside just as another section of the balcony collapsed, a whole corner of it peeling away from the treehouse and crashing into the gully below. The impact sent a shudder through the entire structure, knocking framed photos off the walls and shattering a vase on the kitchenette counter. He slammed the screen door shut, locking it with trembling fingers, and backed away into the center of the room. The floor here was solid, the treehouse still anchored to its surviving support posts, but the balcony was now a jagged wound of splintered timber hanging out over the void. The whisper continued undeterred. It was directly beneath him now, rising up through the gap where the balcony had been, filling the treehouse with Sophie's voice twisted into something monstrous. "Oliver, you can't stay up there forever. The wood is rotting everywhere. Can't you smell it? The termites have been here for years." He could smell it, a damp fungal odor that had seeped into the walls, the bed, the very air he was breathing, the smell of decay that he dismissed as normal jungle humidity when they first checked in. Elias had known, the resort manager with his dismissive reassurances and his refusal to close the Gondwana suite for repairs, too afraid of losing the revenue from its premium pricing. The radio was still on the kitchenette counter, and Oliver lunged for it, pressing the talk button with a thumb slick with sweat. He shouted into the microphone, begging for rescue, telling Elias about the collapse, about the thing in the clearing, about Sophie's voice being stolen and weaponized. Static answered him. No voice, no acknowledgement, just a low, persistent crackle that might have been interference from the storm clouds massing over the mountains, or might have been something else entirely, something that didn't want him reaching the outside world. Then, cutting through the static, a new voice. Sophie's voice again, but this time coming from the radio itself, impossibly clear and close, as if her mouth was pressed directly against the speaker grill. "Oliver, I'm at the lodge. I'm safe. Come meet me. Follow the boardwalk. You can make it. If you run..." He dropped the radio as if it had burned him, watching it clatter across the floor. The voice continued, spilling out of the speaker, repeating the same phrases over and over, each iteration slightly different, as if whatever was generating the transmission was refining its mimicry in real time. He checked his phone, knowing before he looked that there would be no signal. The resort's isolation was total. The nearest town a 3-hour drive along unpaved roads that would be impassable in the wet season. He was alone, trapped in a rotting box above a creature that had stolen his wife's voice and was using it to lure him down into the dark hours past. Measured only by the slow crawl of the digital clock on the oven, the whispering never stopped, cycling through Sophie's vocabulary, testing new words, new inflections, occasionally lapsing back into that guttural, alien register that sounded like stones grinding together underwater. At some point, Oliver realized the voice was learning. The sentences were becoming more complex, the emotional range broader, the pauses more natural, as if the thing below was using its time with him as a language lesson. Around 3 a.m., the voice said something new, something that made the blood freeze in Oliver's veins and the hair on his arms stand up all at once. "Oliver, I'm not Sophie. I was never Sophie, but I have her now. I have all of her, every memory, every secret, every word she ever said to you in the dark." The creature was no longer pretending. It was boasting, reveling in its stolen knowledge, sharing the intimacy of Oliver and Sophie's marriage like a voyeur describing a private film. Oliver pressed his hands over his ears, but the voice seemed to bypass his hearing entirely, resonating directly inside his skull. The treehouse walls vibrated with it, the insect screens humming like a speaker cone, the floorboards transmitting the sound up through the soles of his feet. He ended up crouched in the bathtub, the only part of the structure that didn't have a direct line of sight to the gaping hole where the balcony used to be. He pulled the shower curtain closed and sat in the darkness, waiting for dawn, waiting for rescue, waiting for anything that might break the nightmare's hold. The sun rose slowly, filtering through the canopy in shafts of pale gold. The whispering stopped the moment the first ray touched the clearing below the treehouse, replaced by the normal morning sounds of bird song and rustling leaves, as if the entire horror had been a nocturnal hallucination. Oliver emerged from the bathtub on legs that barely supported him. He looked through the screen door at the wreckage of the balcony, the jagged stumps of the support posts, the dark, damp earth far below, and he saw something that he'd missed in the chaos of the previous night. There were footprints in the mud at the base of the treehouse. Dozens of them, the same long, narrow, bare footprints the staff had found on the trail, circling the structure in a tight, obsessive loop. But among them, pressed deeply into the wet soil, were a second set of tracks, smaller, made by a pair of hiking sandals, the distinctive tread pattern of the ones Sophie had been wearing when she vanished. Her footprints led from the tree line to the base of the collapsed support post, and then they stopped, as if she'd been standing right there when the balcony came down, right there in the path of the falling timber and the creature that had lured her in. Oliver refused to believe what his eyes were telling him. He spent the next several hours shouting Sophie's name into the jungle, ignoring the pain in his raw throat, clinging to the hope that the footprints meant she'd been there, that she'd escaped, that the search party had simply missed her. Ilias and 2 staff members finally reached the treehouse around noon, having cut their way through the overgrown trail with machetes after the boardwalk was blocked by a fallen tree. They found Oliver sitting on the floor, just inside the screen door, his voice gone, his eyes fixed on the clearing below. They never found Sophie's body. The official search lasted 3 weeks, covering every inch of the Daintree within a 10-kilometer radius of the resort. But the jungle doesn't give up its dead easily, and whatever had taken her had hidden her well. The resort closed permanently 6 months later, citing structural issues and a decline in bookings, but the local indigenous rangers, the Kuku-Yalanji people, had their own explanation for what had happened in that ancient forest. They called it the Mimic, a spirit as old as the rainforest itself, a creature that learned the voices of its prey by listening from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to call someone away from safety and into the hungry dark. Oliver moved back to Sydney, to a concrete apartment with no view of any green thing. He sold his hiking boots, threw away his camping gear, and never set foot in a forest again for the rest of his life. But sometimes late at night, when the wind blows through the jacaranda tree outside his bedroom window, he still hears Sophie's voice calling him from somewhere just out of sight, and he has to press his fists against his ears until the sun comes up, reminding himself that whatever is speaking, it isn't her. It never was. The eco-resort was called Bracken Hollow, a former hunting lodge in the Scottish Highlands that had been converted into a luxury retreat for guests who wanted to experience the last remaining fragments of Britain's ancient temperate rainforest. It sat in a valley so remote that the single-track road leading to it washed out twice a year, leaving the property accessible only by a rickety Land Rover and a prayer. George had not come as a guest. He was a volunteer ranger with the Woodland Trust, a gap-year student from Manchester who'd traded his city flat for a damp bothy and a job that involved monitoring red squirrel populations, repairing boardwalk planks, and guiding the occasional birdwatching tour. He'd been at Bracken Hollow for 3 months when the incidents began. Long enough to know the forest's rhythms, its moods, its ordinary sounds, but not long enough to have heard the stories that the older rangers only told after dark, when the rain hammered the tin roof and the fire had burned down to embers. The bungalow assigned to him was a small, single-room structure at the far edge of the property, separated from the main lodge by a quarter-mile of winding gravel path that threaded through a grove of ancient oaks. The trees here were draped in epiphytic ferns and lungwort lichen, their branches so thickly furred with moss that they looked like the arms of green giants frozen mid-gesture. The bungalow itself was basic but comfortable. A narrow bed, a writing desk, a small wood-burning stove, and a set of windows that faced the forest on 3 sides, giving the unsettling impression of being inside a glass box in the middle of the wilderness. George had loved it immediately. The isolation felt liberating after years of cramped city living, and the constant soundtrack of rain and bird song was a welcome replacement for sirens and shouting. His only companion was a trail camera, a waterproof model with infrared night vision that he'd brought from home. He'd set it up on a low branch outside his bungalow, angled toward a game trail that ran behind the building, hoping to capture footage of pine martens or the elusive wildcats rumored to still haunt the glen. The camera had been a gift from his late grandfather, a man who'd spent his retirement photographing badgers in the Yorkshire Dales, and George checked its SD card every evening with the devotion of someone tending a small private shrine. For the first 2 weeks, the camera caught nothing but the usual suspects: a roe deer picking its way through the ferns, a badger snuffling at the base of a birch tree, a tawny owl that triggered the sensor at 3 a.m. and stared directly into the lens with eyes like molten gold. Then, on the 15th night, something new appeared. George was scrolling through the previous night's footage at his desk, a mug of tea steaming beside him, when he reached a clip timestamped at 1:47 a.m. The infrared sensor had activated. the frame shifting from grainy black to a pale, ghostly monochrome as the night vision kicked in. At first, he thought the camera had malfunctioned. The image was blurred, as if something had moved too close to the lens for the autofocus to adjust, and all he could see was a pale, indistinct shape filling the frame. He leaned closer to the laptop screen, squinting. The shape resolved slightly, revealing what looked like a mouth, or part of a mouth, a curve of darkness surrounded by lighter tissue pressed directly against the camera housing. He backed up the footage, watching it frame by frame. The mouth, if it was a mouth, had been exploring the camera, nudging it, testing it, leaving a smear of moisture on the waterproof casing that reflected the infrared light in strange, distorted patterns. Then the mouth opened, and George saw teeth. They were not the needle-sharp fangs of a predator, nor the flat grinding molars of a herbivore. They were something in between, a row of human-like incisors that were slightly too long, slightly too pointed, set in a jaw that was slightly too narrow. The bite mark on the camera casing, which he discovered when he retrieved the device the next morning, was unmistakable, a crescent of small, neat indentations pressed into the rubberized grip, each one deep enough to show the individual tooth profile. George told himself it was a badger. Badgers had teeth like that, didn't they? And they were curious, and they'd been known to chew on trail cameras left in their territories. But the bite mark was too high up the casing for a badger, which would have had to stand on its hind legs and stretch to reach that angle. And the badgers in the footage from previous nights had never shown any interest in the camera at all. He replaced the SD card and reset the camera, positioning it slightly higher on the branch, angled downward to get a wider view of the trail. That night he slept with the curtains open, watching the faint red glow of the camera's status light blink against the dark. The next morning, the camera was gone. Not damaged, not knocked over, not moved a few feet away by a curious animal. Gone. Completely vanished, the branch where it had been mounted stripped of its bark in a spiral pattern that suggested something had wrapped itself around the wood and pulled. George searched the undergrowth for an hour, pushing through wet ferns and nettles until his arms were covered in stinging welts. He found the camera eventually, 30 meters deeper into the forest, lying at the base of a massive oak that had been hollowed out by rot. The casing was intact, the lens unbroken, but the SD card slot was empty, and the body of the camera was covered in bite marks, dozens of them, overlapping and intersecting like the work of something that had been gnawing on the device for hours. He brought the ruined camera back to the bungalow and sat at his desk, turning it over in his hands. The bite marks were concentrated on the grip, the edges, the areas where a human hand would have held the device, as if the thing that had taken it had been trying to taste the places his fingers had touched. A cold, crawling sensation spread across the back of his neck. He looked out the window at the game trail, the ferns still bent where he'd crashed through them, the trees dripping with the remnants of the morning's mist. He decided to report the incident to the head ranger, a grizzled Highlander named Angus, who'd worked at Bracken Hollow for 30 years and had a face like a map of the glen's deepest wrinkles. Angus listened to the whole story without interrupting, then sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. He told George that the forest behind the bungalow had a name, a Gaelic name that translated roughly to the throat of the dark, and that the older rangers avoided that section of the property, especially at night, especially alone. There were stories, Angus said, about something that lived in the hollow oaks, something that had been there long before the hunting lodge was built, long before the first crofters cleared the valley. Something that didn't have a scientific name because the people who got close enough to describe it rarely came back with their voices intact. George listened to all of this with the skepticism of a biology student who'd been raised on David Attenborough documentaries. He thanked Angus for the folklore lesson and went back to his bungalow, determined to set up a replacement camera and prove that the culprit was just a particularly destructive pine marten. He borrowed an older model from the lodge's equipment shed, a battered Nikon with a cracked LCD screen but a functioning infrared sensor. He mounted it in a different location, higher up, secured with a metal bracket and a cable lock that would take bolt cutters to remove. That night he stayed awake past midnight, sitting in the dark, with the curtains open, watching the camera's status light. The rain had stopped. and the forest was silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl and the distant rush of the river in the valley bottom around 200 a.m. The status light went out, not the flicker of a dying battery, but a sudden, complete extinguishment, as if something had covered the lens entirely. George grabbed his headlamp and a walking stick, his heart hammering. He knew it was foolish to go outside, but the camera had cost the trust nearly £300, and he couldn't bear the thought of losing another piece of equipment. He stepped out of the bungalow into the wet, black night, the beam of his headlamp cutting a narrow tunnel through the trees. The camera was 20 meters away, mounted on a birch trunk at the edge of the game trail, and as he approached, he could see that it was still there, still attached to its bracket. What he couldn't see was what was wrapped around it, a pale, fleshy substance that glistened in the headlamp's light, like the skin of a mushroom or the underside of a slug, completely engulfing the camera housing. He stopped 6 feet away, the walking stick trembling in his grip. The substance was moving, slowly contracting and expanding in a rhythmic pulse, as if it was breathing through its own tissue. Then it began to unpeel, peeling back from the camera in long, wet strands that dripped onto the forest floor, and beneath it, George saw the thing's body for the first time. It was long and thin, maybe 4 feet from end to end, with too many limbs. He counted 6, 8, 10, an impossible number of jointed appendages that folded against its pale flanks like the legs of a dead spider. Its skin was the color of cave-dwelling creatures, translucent white with a faint network of blue veins visible beneath the surface, and its head, if the bulbous protrusion at one end could be called a head, was completely featureless except for a single circular opening that pulsed open and closed with a wet, sucking sound. The opening was ringed with teeth, the same human-like teeth that had left their marks on his camera, arranged in concentric circles that spiraled inward toward a dark, glistening throat. George stumbled backward, his heel catching on a root, and he fell hard onto the wet ground. The headlamp flew off his head, landing in the ferns at an angle that cast wild, spinning shadows across the trees. The creature uncoiled itself from the birch trunk, dropping to the forest floor with a soft, heavy thud, and it began to move toward him, not crawling, not slithering, but rolling, its many limbs rotating in a horrible wheel-like motion that carried it over the uneven ground with terrifying speed. George scrambled to his feet and ran. He didn't look back, didn't think, just pumped his legs as hard as he could, crashing through the undergrowth toward the bungalow with the sound of wet limbs churning through dead leaves close behind him. He slammed the door shut, threw the bolt across, and pressed his back against the wood, gasping for breath. The windows showed only the blackness of the forest, the beam of his fallen headlamp still visible as a faint glow through the trees. Then the scratching started, not on the door but on the roof, directly above his head, a sound like fingernails dragging across the corrugated tin. The scratching circled the roof slowly, methodically, pausing at each corner, as if the creature was testing the seams where the tin met the walls. George could hear its breathing, a wet, rasping sound that was somehow louder than the rain that had just started falling again. He crouched in the center of the room, clutching the walking stick like a weapon, his mind reeling through everything he knew about biology that could explain what he'd just seen. There was nothing, no mammal, no reptile, no amphibian matched the description, nothing with 10 limbs and a rolling gait and teeth like human incisors arranged in concentric rings. The scratching continued for almost an hour, moving from the roof to the walls, from the walls to the floorboards beneath the bungalow. George could feel the vibrations through the soles of his boots, a constant reminder that the thing was still there, still exploring the boundaries of his shelter. He stayed frozen in the center of the room until the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the windows. And only when the scratching finally stopped, when the forest returned to its normal morning chorus, did he dare to move. The ground outside the bungalow was covered in tracks. Not the neat, narrow footprints he'd half expected, but a series of strange, circular depressions in the mud, each one about the size of a dinner plate, arranged in a pattern that suggested the rolling motion he'd witnessed. He followed the tracks at a cautious distance, his borrowed camera now clutched in his hands. They led back to the hollow oak, where a dark opening in the trunk revealed a cavity that descended into the earth at a steep angle. The camera on the birch tree was gone. The bracket was still there, still locked, but the camera itself had been removed with a precision that suggested the creature had figured out how the mounting screws worked. George didn't wait for permission from Angus. He packed his rucksack, left a note on the desk, and walked the 6 miles to the nearest village, where he caught a bus to Inverness and then a train back to Manchester. He never returned to Bracken Hollow, never contacted the Woodland Trust again, never even wrote a formal resignation letter. He just vanished from the conservation world as completely as the creature had vanished the camera. The camera that he'd brought back with him, the first one with the bite marks, sat on a shelf in his student flat for the rest of the academic year. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away, couldn't bring himself to look at it either, so he covered it with a cloth and tried to forget it was there. Months later, during a particularly bad bout of insomnia, he finally plugged the camera into his laptop to see if any of the original footage had survived in the internal memory. The SD card was gone, but the device had a small built-in cache that saved a few seconds of footage before writing to the card. The cache contained one single clip, 6 seconds long, recorded on the night the camera was taken. It showed the forest floor from the low angle of the device lying where the creature had dropped it, the infrared night vision casting everything in pale green. In the distance, partially obscured by ferns, George could see the bungalow. He could see himself, a small bright figure in the headlamp beam, stumbling backward and falling to the ground, and between the camera and the bungalow, moving in that horrifying rolling gait, was the creature, its pale body reflecting the infrared light like a ghost, its 10 limbs propelling it forward in a blur of jointed motion. But the worst part, the part that made George eject the memory card and snap it in half and throw the pieces into the canal behind his building, was the audio. The clip had recorded sound, a low, rhythmic vocalization that the creature had been making as it chased him. It was speaking, not in any language George recognized, but with a cadence and intonation that was unmistakably speech, a stream of wet, guttural syllables that sounded almost like a recording being played backward, and among those syllables, repeated over and over like a mantra, was a word that George recognized his own name, spoken with the same inflection he'd used when introducing himself to the other rangers on his first day at Bracken Hollow. The creature had been listening to him, learning from him, studying him for weeks before it finally decided to approach. And the bite marks on the camera, the testing of the equipment, the slow escalation of its curiosity, all of it had been leading up to something that George had narrowly escaped. But he never shook the feeling that the escape had been temporary, that the hollow oak was not the creature's den, but merely one entrance to a network of tunnels that stretched beneath the entire glen, maybe beneath the bungalow itself. He moved flats 6 months later, after waking up one night to find that the cloth had fallen off the camera, and the camera, which had been dead, and batteryless for months, was emitting a faint red glow from its status light. He threw it into the canal too, watched it sink into the murky water, and never owned another camera for the rest of his life. Never hiked, never camped, never walked through a forest after sunset. Because the temperate rainforests of the United Kingdom are small and scattered, remnants of an ancient ecosystem that once covered the entire western coast. But they're still wild, still dark, still hiding things in their hollow trees that have never been catalogued by any scientist. And somewhere in a glen in the Scottish Highlands, on a game trail behind a rotting bungalow, something with 10 limbs and a mouth full of human-like teeth is still waiting, still listening to the voices of the volunteers who come to monitor the squirrels and repair the boardwalks, still learning their names. And that brings us to the end of our journey through the canopy darkness. 4 stories where sustainable luxury crumbled into primal terror. If these accounts have left you feeling that cold prickle on the back of your neck, know that you're not alone. The jungle keeps its secrets well, and tonight we've peeled back just a few of its rotting leaves. Remember, the true horror never lies in the monster itself. It lives in the moment you realize the lock on your door was never built to keep anything out here. At True Terror Files Official, we believe the most chilling stories are the ones that happen to real people. People like Liam, Noah, Oliver, and George, who checked into paradise and checked out, forever changed. Their experiences remind us that isolation can transform even the most beautiful places into claustrophobic death traps, and that the nearest help is often much too far away. We pour countless hours into researching, writing, and narrating these accounts to bring you authentic nightmares. So if the scratching in the bamboo walls felt a little too real tonight, please take a moment to show your support. Hit that like button and smash subscribe with the notification bell. Every single action helps the channel grow and allows us to unearth more terrifying true stories from the darkest corners of the map. Drop a comment down below and tell us which story unsettled you the most. Was it the handprints under the glass floor or the voice that stole a wife's final words? Your engagement fuels this community of horror seekers, and we read every single spine-chilling thought you share. Until next time, keep your mosquito net secured, double-check your door latch, and whatever you do, don't look down through the floorboards.